around narrowing the definition of national security and ensuring that we rebuild that confidence. I look forward to the further progress of the legislation.
The Honourable Mark Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's my great pleasure to take a call on this, the second reading of the Intelligence and Security Bill. Can I just start by, first of all, Mr Speaker, acknowledging our officials and advisers that are in the public gallery today. Without their support throughout the Select Committee process, we could not have returned this legislation back into the House. So I just want to take an opportunity, first of all, to acknowledge you guys and the great work that you've done in supporting the committee. Can I please acknowledge the Minister, the Honourable Chris Finlayson, and I think that the Honourable David Parker paid a very fitting tribute to him in terms of the support that the committee has received and the work that we've done. Can I also acknowledge the committee as the outgoing chair? Can I acknowledge the incoming chair, Todd Muller, who has been a member of the committee throughout the entire process, has heard the submissions, understands the legislation very well, and is now continuing to guide the legislation through the House. Can I congratulate him and wish him all the best in chairing what I feel is a very good committee. Can I also acknowledge the Deputy Chair, Dr Shane Retty, for the support that you've given throughout the process as well. Shane, I appreciate that. Can I acknowledge? Yeah, you're there in moral support. That's right, David. David Shearer, who actually took the lead on the opposition side throughout the process, which started with the Countering Foreign Fighters Bill. Can I acknowledge him and Phil Goff? David Parker, who has now come onto the committee, and Dr Kennedy Graham, who has also been an integral part of the process. Lindsay Tish, Jamie Lee Ross, the Honourable David Bennett, and also Fletcher Tabato from New Zealand First. It's important for me to make those acknowledgements because this is my chance to put it on record. Can I speak to one part of the bill, Mr Speaker, and which is fairly important, or it is very important. I am going to cut short my contribution so that Todd Muller has got more time to speak to the bill. But I want to speak about the business record authorisation. So through the committee process, there was a recommendation for a new scheme for mandatory disclosure of business record information held by telecommunications network operators and financial service providers. This information includes, for example, phone records, customer subscribed details and bank statements. It does not include the contents of any communication. So access to this type of information is crucial for the agencies to operate, especially in the early stages of an intelligence investigation. And at the moment, this information is disclosed on a voluntary basis because of an exemption from the Privacy Act's information privacy principles. The purpose of the new framework is to maintain the agency's current access to business record information, not to give them access to anything new. And this was very important because before this there hadn't really been any real clarity around how that information exchange was going to take place. And now inside the bill we've captured, and it's now very clear in terms of how that process is going to work. I just want to very quickly refer to a comment that the last speaker mentioned, and that's around when we look around the world globally now. There's unfortunately there is a fair bit of instability. We're seeing the coalition forces in Iraq being very effective in the war against ISIS or Daesh, and they're putting pressure on them. But one thing that will create is that you'll start to see other or more activity springing up around the world as the pressure comes on in Syria and Iraq. It's very important, and I'm not being an alarmist at all. We're very lucky in this country that we've got an outstanding SIS and GCSB service. It's their job to make sure that they do the best job they can to keep our country safe and keep us all safe. This piece of legislation goes a long way to ensuring and making sure that they're able to do that. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker.
Dr Kennedy Graham.